Tenkaichi 3 may not be the most punishing Dragon Ball Z game out there, but it hides some challenges that can break even seasoned players. One of the game's toughest? Facing off against the ultimate fighters at the end of Mission 100, a relentless gauntlet of battles designed to put your skills to the test. Determined to conquer it, I decided to play Tenkaichi 3 for 100 days to see if I could beat the game's ultimate fighter. But there was a catch. I imposed a few rules to keep the challenge both interesting and realistic. As shocking as it may seem, I do actually have a life. So I set a time limit of 30 minutes of gameplay per day. I couldn't spend hours playing, but I needed enough time to make real progress, especially since some of the fights can drag on, especially if you're not great at the game, which admittedly I'm not. Second, I had to play 100 days in a row. I didn't want to lose momentum, and I also wanted to sharpen my skills before the release of Sparking Zero. Taking long breaks between sessions would just make me forget what I'd learned. And finally, no outside help. No guides, no walkthroughs, no online tutorials. Every victory and every failure would come purely from what I could learn and master in-game. Will I be able to defeat Tenkaichi 3's ultimate challenge, or will Tenkaichi 3 get the best of me? Only time will tell. I started my journey through Dragon Ball Z Tenkaichi 3 with a mix of excitement and nostalgia. I skipped the basics, eager to dive back into the story mode. But right away, I struggled to remember the controls, pressing the wrong buttons during fights against Raditz and Nappa, losing battles I knew I should have been able to win. Frustrated, I lowered the difficulty to give myself time to relearn everything, but I felt like I'd lost all of my Tenkaichi 3 skills from a couple of years ago. As I worked my way through the Saiyan saga, I faced new challenges, from trying to master the Kaioken to figuring out how to handle giant characters like Grade 8 Vegeta. While some battles gave me a confidence boost, enough to raise the difficulty back to normal, others knocked me back down. Vegeta in particular kept kicking my ass, reminding me that I wasn't quite ready to play on normal difficulty just yet. I dropped it back down to easy and kept going, trying not to feel too defeated. The Android saga brought back so many memories from the series. I've always loved this part of the story, and it was fun to see how the game captured those moments. By the time I reached the Cell saga, my favourite in the series, I was finally starting to feel more comfortable with the controls. I loved playing from Cell's perspective, trying to achieve his perfect form, even though my controller decided to die mid-battle. Luckily, I was still able to beat the Cell saga, and that small victory gave me a bit more confidence. But the ups and downs were constant. After several battles where I barely scraped by, I realised that I was too focused on winning at any cost. I wasn't actually getting better at the game, just relying on cheap tactics. I decided to shift my approach, learning to dodge and focus more on positioning. Getting behind opponents became my new strategy. And once I figured that out, I started to enjoy the fights more, even though they are still challenging. The fight against Kid Buu during the Majin Buu saga was a nightmare. He's so aggressive and I lost so many times. But once I got used to Kid Buu's moveset, things finally started to go my way. That sense of relief when I finished the Majin Buu saga was unreal. Bloody Kid Buu, my freaking worst enemy. In between the main storylines, I took on some of the special saga fights, facing off against characters like Broly, Janemba and Metal Cooler. It was a nice break from the more intense sagas, and it brought back some personal memories too. I thought back about the time my mum rented Cooler's Revenge for me when I was sick. That memory made the battle with Cooler feel a little special, even though I've never been a huge fan of his movies. As the days went on, I found myself making small improvements. I wasn't just button mashing anymore, I was actually thinking about my moves and timing. The big breakthrough came when I realised how important dodging and positioning is. That tactic helped me a lot during the GT saga, especially against Omega Shenron. I felt like I was finally getting the hang of things, and when I started the Dragon Ball saga, I had the most fun I've had in the game so far.
Put your hands up.
No.
What?
I said no.
Why not?
I don't want to.
But I've got a gun.
I don't care.
Doesn't make any sense.
Too bad.
Playing as Kid Goku was such a joy. He's quick and I love how easy it was to get behind opponents. Beating this saga also unlocked the What If saga, which I couldn't wait to dive into. The What If scenarios were a blast. One of the highlights was the Saiyan Revolt, where I got to fight as Vegeta, Fascia, Bardock, and even King Vegeta. It was a marathon of a fight, and I struggled at times, especially when I tried to play King Vegeta like his son and kept spamming Ki Blasts, which didn't work. But in the end, I managed to finish off Frieza with Bardock's ultimate attack.
Ever forgive you.
The final fight in the story mode with the Devilman was a fun way to wrap things up. I love how his ultimate attack dealt damage based on how evil the character was. It made the fight against Frieza and his soldiers feel different from any other fight. And just like that, I'd completed the story mode on normal difficulty. Even though I knew I had a long way to go, I was determined to come back and beat the entire game on hard. This whole experience has been about more than just winning battles. It's been about reclaiming the skills I lost, reliving some of my favourite Dragon Ball Z moments, and finding joy in the journey of getting better. Now you're probably thinking, it took you 26 days just to finish the story? Yes, it did. Even though there is a strict time limit to this challenge, I don't want to just rush through everything. I still wanted to enjoy the game. I'm already a quarter of the way through the 100 days, and now it is time to get a bit more focused in improving my Tenkaichi skills. After completing the story mode, I decided to enter the World Tournament. Although I was reminded of how frustrating it is that you can only enter specific tournaments at certain times in Tenkaichi 3. I couldn't decide whether to play as Teen Gohan or Kid Goku, but I eventually chose Gohan because I haven't played him in a while, and let's face it, Kid Goku's inability to fly would get me ringed out way too often. Even though the tournament difficulty was randomized, it didn't feel as hard as I expected. I think I've gotten better, or maybe the tournament just wasn't that challenging. The semi-finals against Adult Gohan was a breeze, but the finals against Videl, that caught me off guard. She was way more aggressive than I had anticipated, and I barely won. I really thought she was going to knock me out of the ring. The next day I kept entering and exiting the World Tour mode until a new tournament opened up, and it was the big tournament on easy difficulty, which meant facing Hercule in the finals. It wasn't a challenge at all, but still fun. It made me think about how much I've improved. Just a few weeks ago, I was struggling with easy fights. That progress felt good, and I hoped I'd keep feeling this way once the 100 days were up. I started taking on more tournaments with mixed results. Cell kicked my ass twice before I finally beat him, but I took some time to recover by entering another easy tournament with Super Saiyan 4 Gogeta, and absolutely crushed everyone. I even tried out Yamcha's tournament, where you're forced to use random characters. I ended up with Mecha Frieza, and though I didn't really know how to play as him, I did alright. The final fight against Yamcha was pretty fun. He and I just kept trying to hit each other with powered up Ki Blasts, but luckily for me, Frieza's paralyzes on impact. It almost went sideways when I mistimed an ultimate, but I pulled through. One day I dedicated myself to Mission 100, a marathon of fights that seems endless. Along the way I realized how much I loved playing as Trunks, and how insanely strong Kid Buu is. Some missions were locked, which meant going into Sim Dragon mode.
What the fuck is this piece of shit?
A mode I'm not fond of, but it had to be done. It was frustrating to redo some missions when my progress didn't save from the day before, but I kept pushing forward, trying out new characters and learning their strengths and weaknesses. Super Saiyan 2 Teen Gohan became a favourite. I found his transformations to be the most fun, especially his agility and fast-hitting combos. Android 17 also turned out to be a beast. His ki builds quickly, and his Blast 2 move almost always hits. I realised that focusing on a few characters was helping me overcome a plateau I'd hit in the game. Not every day was great though. Some days, like when I had to redo entire missions due to forgetting to save.
That settles it, you are an idiot.
I've gotten too used to autosaves. And sometimes I found myself struggling with fights I should have easily won. One of the toughest challenges came during the Besieging Cell mission, a marathon of fights against powerful enemies ending with Teen Gohan. After losing repeatedly, I finally clutched the win. It felt like a real accomplishment. Some days I switched things up by starting with tournaments as a warm-up, and that really helped. Eventually I reached a mission facing off against legendary Super Saiyan Broly. He is a bit of a nightmare. His high health, defense, and powerful hits almost broke me. But after fighting him, taking on Bojack next felt like a breeze. As I continued playing, I realized that characters with explosive wave type attacks were my go-to, especially Android 17 with his barrier move. It was a great counter for super and ultimate attacks. I started running out of unlocked missions, which meant driving back into Sim Dragon mode again.
Is it easy? No. Do I like it? No, I don't. But do I do it? Yeah, I do, because I gave myself an ultimatum.
I kept experimenting with characters like Gogeta and Vegito, and even though I struggled with them initially due to their different movesets, I slowly got the hang of it. The difficulty was ramping up, but I managed to complete most missions on the first try. I felt proud of my progress, especially compared to where I started. With each new fight, I was learning more about the game and getting better. Sure, there was frustrating moments, but looking back, I could see how far I'd come. Every day brought new challenges, but also new victories, and I couldn't wait to see how much further I could push myself in the days to come. I decided to take on the challenge of completing the story mode on hard, and it quickly became clear that I was in for a rough ride. The first fight was a serious wake-up call as I got completely wrecked. The AI was dodging and countering way more than I was used to, and I wasn't prepared for it. I thought I'd be fine after doing well in mission 100, but in the story mode I didn't get to pick my characters, and there were no Z items to help me out. I struggled a lot with early Goku, which I wasn't really used to, but eventually I got better with Piccolo when I discovered that he could paralyze opponents. After a few tries, I managed to beat Raditz, though I was close to resetting the fight halfway through. It was one of those moments where sticking it out really paid off. The fight with Nappa started off just as badly, and it felt like the game didn't want you to win unless you were Goku.
Son die like this? I won't curse. I won't scream. I'll just be zen.
But once I switched to Goku, things went smoother. After that, I took on Vegeta, and though I didn't take full advantage of some openings, I managed to beat him on the first try. I considered moving on to the Frieza saga, but I wasn't in the mood, so I switched over to Sim Dragon to lock some more missions. By the end of that session, I'd unlocked about 20 new missions. The next day I didn't feel like playing much, so I opted for a survival challenge. It seemed easy at first because the fighters don't have much health, but then I realised that there was no way I was going to beat this within the 30-minute time limit. And I didn't. I wasn't even close. The day after, I decided to finally tackle the Frieza saga on hard, and things got difficult fast. The first fight went well since it was heavily in my favour, but I struggled with first form Frieza. I just don't know how to play as him and lost repeatedly. Eventually I found my groove with his later forms, especially third form, and I started having fun, but by the time I had finished the final fight, my hands were aching. When I moved on to the Android saga, things went surprisingly well. The fight with Android 19 and 20 was easy, and while I didn't enjoy playing as semi-perfect Cell this time around, I managed to pass the stage. But then in the final showdown with Cell, right at the end of the match, I messed up a beam struggle and got pretty pissed off. My second attempt didn't start well either, but I eventually pulled it together and beat him the old-fashioned way, without relying on the father and son Kamehameha prompt. I learnt my lesson there. I felt a sense of satisfaction thinking back to how much I struggled on normal mode, and now getting through on hard without being completely wrecked. I kept up the grind with more missions and tournaments, unlocking characters and Dragon Balls here and there. Some days were better than others. I felt completely over it. I started losing to giant characters, which are my least favourite to fight, and ended the day early. The next day I focused on Dragon Ball grinding, playing the same fight over and over again to collect all 7 Dragon Balls. After summoning Shenron, I unlocked Future Gohan, which felt like a small win after all that work. As I kept pushing forward, the Mission 100 fights started to ramp up in difficulty. Using unfamiliar characters led to me getting stomped repeatedly, which was frustrating but also the only way I was going to improve. The challenge forced me to keep learning and experimenting with new tactics. It became clear that if I wanted to make it through the hardest missions, I needed to get better at characters that I wasn't necessarily used to. The Special Saga was another beast altogether. The fights weren't necessarily hard, but they were long, and fighting giant characters again was a nightmare. The Hurricane fight in particular accounted for most of my losses in the story mode. After what felt like an eternity, I finally reached the point where I could use the Dragon Fist prompt and end the fight, vowing never to deal with that mess again. Eventually I reached the Buu Saga, and it was as rough as I expected. Majin Vegeta completely destroyed me on the first attempt, but I managed to pull it together on the second try. The fight with Kid Buu was one of the most difficult and frustrating parts of the entire playthrough. His aggressive AI meant I had to restart the fight over and over until I finally beat him by spamming Dragon Fist. Even then, I had to fight him again immediately after, which felt like torture. After so many retries, finally finishing that saga was a huge relief. Never again. Towards the end, I felt like my progress had stalled out. I was struggling with the harder missions and felt like I wasn't getting any better. I was really tempted to look up more advanced tutorials online, but because of my self-imposed rules, I had to push through on my own. I went back to the story mode to unlock all the alternate endings and found some of the extra fights just as tricky. One fight in particular, Goku vs Majin Vegeta, was brutal because he can't use prompts. It was a great challenge, but frustrating nonetheless. Finally, I completed the entirety of the story mode on hard, finishing off the Dragon Ball and What If sagas. The What If fights were tough, especially against O'Reilly, who KO'd me more times than I'd like to admit. But I pushed through, and when I finished the final fight, I felt an overwhelming sense of accomplishment. I had done it. I'd bet the game on hard. Now I need to figure out my next steps to really master the game and tackle those ultimate fighters. It has been a long and exhausting journey, but I was pleased with how far I'd come. For the past 75 days, I've been facing new hurdles, learning new techniques, and trying to improve my overall gameplay. I had just finished the story mode on hard and had completed about 80% of the Mission 100. Though I had made noticeable progress, I knew I had a long way to go. One of my biggest struggles from the start was dodging and guarding. I was finding Blast 2 attacks especially difficult to avoid, and for some reason, the further away I was, the worse I did. It seems counterintuitive, but I realized that having more time to react made me overthink my moves, which led to mistakes. I wasn't sure how to effectively dodge or block melee Blast 2s either. Sometimes I managed to block them, but other times I'd fail, and I couldn't figure out what I was doing wrong. I spent a solid 20 minutes practicing dodging, and by the end my fingers were sore, but I was determined to keep going. Eventually I decided to test my skills against Krillin in one of the Ultimate Warrior fights. It was a rough start. I got thrown around a lot, but after shaking off the rust, I managed to beat him. It wasn't perfect and I had to use 2 characters, but it was progress. Determined to find new characters that might suit me better, I spent a full week competing in tournaments, trying out as many fighters as I could. Krillin, Mid Vegeta, King Vegeta and Yamcha were the first batch I experimented with. Unsurprisingly, Vegeta was a standout, but King Vegeta left me underwhelmed. He felt sluggish compared to his son, and his Blast 2 moves didn't pack the punch I expected. Yamcha's fights were strange because the AI seemed uninterested in engaging with me. At one point, one of the AI just flew off the side of the stage, and I won the match without even trying. That was one of the easiest victories, but it didn't do much for improving my skills. Not all tournaments went smoothly though. I remember facing Great Ape Nappa twice in a row while playing as Sword Trunks. Giants are such a pain to deal with. Their super armor makes it really annoying to stagger them, and they're so difficult to dodge. On my first attempt, Nappa knocked me out of the ring and I lost. To my dismay, I faced him again in my second attempt. The frustration was real, but after some hard fought battles, I was able to win the tournament. I liked playing as Sword Trunks, but I still preferred his long haired version. Is that what it's called? Day 80 brought a pleasant surprise. I ended up playing as Berta, a character I had never really used before, and he quickly became a favourite. His speed was incredible and I breezed through the tournament. What made this victory even sweeter was that I won without using any Z items, which made me curious about how much stronger he could be with some upgrades. But after upgrading Berta with all the Z items I wanted, turns out I don't like him. I tried playing as Great Saiyaman, an offshoot of Adult Gohan, one of my favourite characters, and it was a disaster. His moves feel weak and ineffective, especially his blast attacks. Apart from Explosive Wave, which needed 4 key bars to use, his moves just weren't worth it. It was the last time I bothered with him. Despite my struggles, I kept pushing forward, alternating between characters and refining my playstyle. I tried out Super Saiyan 3 Goku, which was tough because I'm not a fan of that transformation, but it had the advantage of bypassing super armor, something I hate even more than Super Saiyan 3. During a match against Giant Lord Slug, I accidentally reverted to base form, which completely threw me off, and I lost. I tried again and discovered that certain characters could teleport at will in full power mode, something I hadn't known before. These little discoveries kept me going even when things didn't go as planned. One of the hardest tournaments I faced was the Cell Games, as it is a survival tournament, meaning your health does not fully replenish between fights. I played as Kid Trunks, which wasn't the best choice, and I ended up fighting Perfect Cell early in the tournament. I hadn't realised you could face him before the finals, and it completely caught me off guard. My health was low for the rest of the tournament and I was knocked out early on. It took several more attempts, but I finally made it to the finals with almost no health left. Somehow I managed to win, barely hanging on by the skin of my teeth. Victories like that are what make it all worth it. They remind me why I love playing these games. Throughout this challenge, I spent a lot of time with Future Gohan, a character I really liked despite his weaknesses. Compared to Android 17, Gohan felt underpowered, but I kept using him because he's just fun to play. His moveset wasn't the easiest and I found it hard to recover from mistakes, especially in his Super Saiyan form. He has Evil Barrier, a move similar to Android 17's, but it requires 2 stocks instead of 1, making it less efficient. I practiced with him in training mode to get better at his combos, focusing on vanishing moves and dragon dashes. I was slowly improving, but the Z counters remained a thorn in my side. The timing was tricky and I often missed the mark, but I kept at it. As the challenge neared its end, I realised I was still missing King Cold, the last character I needed to unlock. To do that, I had to beat the Cell Saga on the hardest difficulty, so I gave it my best shot. My first few attempts were tough. Sometimes the matchups were just brutal, but on one attempt, Cell decided to spam Blast 2s, which I managed to punish with my own attacks. That was the key to unlocking King Cold, and the satisfaction of finally completing the character roster was incredible. I also earned another Dragon Ball, which was the cherry on top. Despite being so close to the end, I knew there was still work to be done, particularly in mastering Z counters and vanishing attacks. These mechanics were crucial in high level play, so I dedicated my practice to them, focusing on key characters: Super Saiyan 2 Adult Gohan, Super Saiyan 2 Teen Gohan, Future Gohan, and Android 17. Clearly, one of these things was not like the others. Future Gohan was my personal favourite, but consistently gave me trouble, especially against tough opponents like Perfect Cell. His playstyle was just trickier to get a hang of, but I was determined not to give up on him. Z counters were a challenge because they require precise timing within the heat of battle. I would often misjudge the moment to counter, leaving myself vulnerable, but I steadily improved. Vanishing attacks, on the other hand, became my saving grace in tight situations. The more I practiced, the more intuitive they became, allowing me to evade attacks and create openings for counters. It was slow progress, but progress nonetheless, and I could feel the difference with every fight. And one day I managed to clear 5 missions, which felt like a significant victory after days of trial and error. Each mission pushed me harder than the last, but instead of getting frustrated, I leaned into the grind. I had fully upgraded my characters with all the Z items I'd earned over time, tailoring each to my specific playstyle, whether it was enhancing their ki recovery or boosting their defense against tough enemies. This customization was key in taking down the ultimate fighters in the final stretch. With just 3 missions left, I was staring down the toughest opponents I'd faced yet. After more than 90 days of highs and lows, I could finally see the finish line. There was no doubt in my mind, I was ready for whatever came next. Over the course of 100 days, I set out to tackle one of the toughest challenges in Dragon Ball Z Budokai Tenkaichi 3, Mission 100. Each day was a step closer to the ultimate goal of defeating the game's most powerful fighters. I started the journey with excitement, determined to push through, but as the days went on, the difficulty began to mount. One of the last fights left was against Super Saiyan 4 Vegeta, one of my favourite characters. I wish I could say that all the time I spent playing Tenkaichi 3 made this fight easy, but it didn't. Vegeta was relentless, and every moment of that fight was a struggle. Still, I managed to power through and defeat him, and felt a great sense of accomplishment. As soon as that fight ended, I was thrown into the battle with Super Saiyan 4 Goku, and honestly, this fight went better than the one with Vegeta. Maybe it's just my preference for Vegeta talking, but Goku seemed a little easier to manage. That said, the fight was still intense. There were moments when Goku got the upper hand, but I managed to keep my cool and win. I started to think that maybe, just maybe, I had gotten the hang of this challenge, but nothing could have prepared me for the fight that awaited me next. Super Saiyan 4 Gogeta, the fusion of Goku and Vegeta, and one of the strongest characters in the entire game. This was what all the previous battles had been leading up to, and I was both excited and nervous. The fight started, and within seconds, I knew I was in trouble. Gogeta's power was overwhelming, and no matter what I did, I couldn't seem to break through. After a long, brutal struggle, I lost. I felt frustrated, but I wasn't ready to give up. I knew I could do better. The next day, I decided to rethink my strategy. Tenkaichi 3 uses a destruction point system, meaning each character is assigned a point value, and you can build your team as long as you stay within the limit. For this mission, I was allowed 20 destruction points, but on my first attempt, I accidentally limited myself to 15 points, thinking the mission was stricter than it was. This small oversight made the fight much harder than it needed to be. So for my next attempt, I carefully picked my team. I started with Super Saiyan 2 Adult Gohan, my go-to character who always comes through in tough fights. Android 17 was next. He only costs 5 points, which is a steal for how strong he is. For my final slot, I considered Super Saiyan 2 Teen Gohan, but didn't have enough points, so I went with base form Trunks, who is faster and whose moveset I prefer over his Super Saiyan form. This time, the fight started much better. I landed the first hit on Gogeta and followed it up with a combo that pushed him back. Things were going so well that I started to think I could win the entire fight with just Gohan. But Gogeta is no pushover. As soon as he started landing hits, my health plummeted. His attacks were brutal, and before I knew it, Gohan was down. But I wasn't done yet. Android 17 stepped in, and I felt confident I could finish the fight with him. However, my overconfidence got the best of me. Gogeta activated his wild sense ability and dodged my attacks effortlessly. Then he caught me in a pursuit combo, and things started to look grim. Thankfully, all those days spent practicing Z counters paid off. I managed to counter his pursuit just in time, and with one final strike, I took down Super Saiyan 4 Gogeta.
Wow, you are just the grand central station of disappointment, aren't you?
After that win, I realized it wasn't actually day 100. It was only day 95. I still had 5 days left, but the hardest part of the challenge was behind me. For the remaining days, I let myself relax and just enjoy the game. I replayed some missions, completed the survival mode, even though I went over the time limit, but we'll let that one slide, and participated in a few tournaments. At that point, it wasn't about the challenge anymore. It was about having fun and reflecting on how much I'd improved over the past 100 days. Looking back, I realized there were things I would have done differently. For one, I wouldn't have spent so much time on a hard playthrough of the story mode. It didn't really help me practice for the challenges ahead. It was more about proving to myself that I could do it, which is, I guess, is something. I also wasted a lot of time on Sim Dragon, which I didn't even need to finish to unlock the missions I needed. And lastly, I wish I had focused on mastering a smaller pool of characters earlier on. I spent so much time switching between characters that I never fully mastered any of them. But despite those missteps, I'm proud of what I accomplished. I pushed through tough fights, learned from my mistakes, and in the end, I beat some of the strongest fighters in the game. More importantly, I had fun doing it. That's what made the 100-day journey worth it. I set out to complete Mission 100, and while I did just that, I also came away with a deeper appreciation for the game and its mechanics.